Welcome to PhD&D on YouTube. This video is going to be sort of a response to, or more so inspired by, Anders' video, Wood WWAD, on dusting off dungeons, the way to properly do a dungeon. There's such an abused setting nowadays that I feel compelled to kind of give my take on it, and I hope you're ready to listen. So, once again, this is a response, but more so inspired by, because he didn't really pose a question. So I'm going to repeat some of the things he said, because that was one of the best videos I've seen in a long time, honestly. And I'll put a link down below to it. If you haven't seen it, it's worth the time. But I'm going to give some of my opinion here, and it will echo some of his as well. So, first of all, I've seen so many GMs abuse dungeons. It's just sad. One of the tabletop game that started tabletop role-playing games, Dungeons and Dragons, that's kind of a big deal. And to see it abused so much, it's just sad. And I don't know if it's that they've never had one run for them the right way, or if it's just become so, overused. I don't know. Not going to talk about that. But first off, GMs will use it when, in my experience, I've seen it happen when they're underprepared, when they didn't have the time to fully sit down and plan out a session, or sit down to even think about a session. They just, we'll do a dungeon. That's easy. I can just map it out on the grid here as we go, and that's not a problem. Because, once again, I think they're just overused. But think about what a dungeon really is, first of all. A dungeon is a subterranean, either prison of some sort, or usually guarding something, or maybe it's not even a finished product. Maybe it is natural caverns that are being used for some purpose. Find out that purpose first. But you got to keep in mind they are subterranean. They're underground. They're dark. There's hardly any light sources. They smell probably really bad. Or maybe they just smell really wet, or maybe stale, or maybe whatever is special about your dungeon can be caught in that sense of smell. Use the senses in a dungeon. That's one of the best things you can do. He talked about it. I'll talk about it a little bit, but use the senses. There's so many opportunities there, so don't skip out on that. More often than not, a dungeon is not built either for aesthetics. It is built for a purpose, or it is crafted for some purpose. If it's built for aesthetics, that's fine. Have a reason for that, though. There better be a story behind that. Now, when I run a dungeon, I find the best way to do it as well is to, if you've got decent light source in your room, full of players, your game room, turn it off. Dim the lights. Very few dungeons are extremely well lit, if at all. In the dungeons that have been lost to time, where the characters weren't even aware it existed until they found out through an NPC or some scribe on some scroll, chances are they're not lit very well. If they are, that's fine, but I feel like a dungeon mindset here is what I'm going for, is if you dim the lights or take them out completely in your game room and just use a single candle or single lamp or something. Careful with candles, by the way. Gamers get very excited and you don't want that ending up on your character sheet. But have that very low light source that can really change the mood in the room. Lower your music if you've got music, or switch over to, like my party has, dungeon sounds, like dripping. There's sounds of echoes down a hallway. We've even got one track where every couple of minutes you hear different types of roars, which just kind of scares the party, like they actually heard something, but don't know what it is at all, which is kind of cool to see their reaction to that. And take control of the table as a GM. This is a crucial moment. You need to take control of the table. You need to dominate the conversation. You need to narrate the story you're telling. Dungeons are not a funny place, and player talk, which is a whole other argument in itself, but player talk, especially in dungeons, ruins that mindset, in my opinion. Now there's bound to be a little bit, but really take control. And when you're telling the story, make sure they know it and they're not talking. You can set the mood so much better that way. Another big one, and I think well, I know Ander would agree with this point, and I'm not quite as extreme on it, but forget the grid. Forget grids right now because they will trap you in a bad mindset when creating a dungeon. I've fallen into that trap, and here I'll explain it a little bit. If you like grids and you're using them, and you say, well, I'm just not going to forget that, then master the fog of war. Master using either black construction paper, black t-shirts, something, because I don't care who you are, if the whole dungeon's laid out on a grid, it's really hard as a player to try to ignore the parts you can't see. It's really hard. It takes a special group of people to be able to play that out right. So, once again, I should say, for now, forget the grid. Grids lead to thinking in terms of squares, is what I've found out. Grids, you think in terms of squares when creating a dungeon. I've sat down with graph paper before, or gridded paper, and to create a dungeon because it's so easy on there. And all the hallways and corridors, are 5 or 10 feet wide. And that's just not the case in a real dungeon. Usually it's not fantastic construction like we were talking about. Could be, but not always. And chances are with a grid, you're going to fall into that trap of just staying on the lines in some way. So, once again, like I said, corridors are not always 5 or 10 feet wide. That's kind of the phrase I'll use to show that grids really do ruin creating a good dungeon. Characters, for instance, might need to squeeze through like an 18-inch gap in a hallway where either rubble's collapsed in, or maybe this dungeon was built into a natural cavern and that part was just funneled in and there's only an 18-inch pass. They're going to have to shuffle sideways to get through that. That makes it a little more interesting. It's not just, straight shot down the hallway. What all do they see? No. Same thing with that. Characters might have to crawl, prone. They might have to go prone. Maybe it's only an 18-inch or a 2-foot gap where they actually have to get down, an army crawl through it to get to the next place. Sizes of chambers and corridors differ greatly underground. Things could have changed over time. They kind of like, if you've ever seen the movie The Rock, where they talk about Alcatraz, it's been rebuilt on top of itself so many times that the tunnels are just ridiculous. It's not nice and orderly under there, and it's not going to be in a dungeon that's underground. So keep those things in mind. Now, characters also might need to step over giant piles of rubble, or they may actually need to move rubble to get to where they need to go. So, and I'll get to how to map one out here in a little bit, but these are just things to keep in mind. And I think Ander covered it where he talked about traps as well. Traps, he goes into detail, I think, in another video on traps anyways, but maybe a trap has been sprung. Dungeons aren't just full of traps ready, to get your players. A trap may have been sprung, there may be a corpse there showing exactly what happened with this trap. Maybe a giant boulder came down and you just see a skeleton underneath it. Maybe you see a skeleton pinned to a wall with arrows sticking out. Something that could have actually been sprung. So they see the trap, but it poses no threat at this point. It's just kind of there to say, okay, this place may contain other traps. This guy was very unfortunate and found one. Like I said earlier, light sources, think about that. Sounds, echo, so make sure occasionally, you let them know that they can hear the echoing of their footsteps. Or when they talk, make sure players around the table, to keep it as in character as they can, make sure they lower their voices. Make sure they're kind of whispering to each other. If one of them yells across the table or yells something, tell that in the story. Make sure they know that echoed down a hallway quite far. That'll spook them a little bit, and they'll kind of be on their guard, which is the dungeon mindset that I've been talking about. Think about the inhabitants of this dungeon. Are there creatures down there? How are they living? Food sources, water sources. Once again, Andrew talks about some of these. What are they doing during the day? Are they always looking for food? Are they just kind of moving about? Do they have a way in the dungeon? Maybe they don't live in there. Maybe that's a passageway they take to get somewhere. So think about that. What do they look like? Here I like to use kind of the phrase of think deep in the ocean. Way, way deep in the ocean on Earth. There are creatures down there that no one's ever seen. There's creatures that a couple that we have seen that only live down there that just look spooky. Just when you see them, you're just like, that doesn't even look real. That's what you might find in a dungeon. These aren't usually creatures that just roam around and are well known about. Maybe if there's some goblins or something down there, but really get into the descriptions of these things. Maybe it's a type of goblin, but maybe over time they've evolved to suit this dungeon. Maybe their eyes look different. Maybe they can see in the dark. They've adapted. So really think about how strange these creatures are that live underground in these dungeons. Okay, there's a couple points. I'm going to get now to creating a dungeon, how I go about it. First of all, I like to be prepared and know exactly what the dungeon looks like. I don't like to make it room by room. I like to have it out. So, blank piece of paper. Forget those grids. Get a blank piece of paper to draw this thing out. Now, close your eyes when you're doing this and actually walk through this dungeon yourself. Sounds weird, I know it does, but get up out of your seat, pretend for a little bit. Go back to when you were a kid. If you were in a dungeon, let's say you're in your bedroom or you're in your study, wherever you do your adventure writing. As a kid, if you wanted to go to a dungeon or play dungeon or something, what would you do? You would not just sit there and stare at a sheet of paper. You'd get up, you'd feel it, you'd use your imagination. You might, squeeze into your closet. You may be crawling under things, stepping over things. Get up and do that. Sounds goofy, like I said, but it'll get you in the mindset to know that, okay, characters really do have to get over something, or they have to get down and crawl, see what that feels like, squeeze through gaps, whatever it takes. But walk yourself through this dungeon in your head. What are you seeing? What are you smelling? What are you hearing? Get all those senses that a character's going to get and move how that character would move. Maybe put on a pack full of stuff and see, what that would take. Know how they're feeling, because when you can personally walk through that dungeon in your mind, you can convey it in a much more magnificent way, storytelling-wise. You've been there. You've been to that location. It's not just something you came up with on a piece of graph paper. You've been there. You can make a great story out of it. So that is how I go about creating it. Just a couple other things, random notes I got here at the end. Rooms may serve no purpose at all. Maybe they used to. Maybe there's clues to that. Or maybe they really don't serve a purpose. It's a cavern that was just used for nothing at all. Careful with these. Don't do too many, especially if you have players that really don't like dead ends that have no purpose. So just a couple of those sprinkled in there. And when it comes to the ultimate purpose of a lot of dungeons, treasure, we're talking about what's at the end of this dungeon. Maybe the treasure, once they've gone through this whole thing, maybe it's gone. Maybe somebody beat them there. It can happen. They could go through this whole dungeon. That's why some of the traps were sprung. They get to the treasure and find out somebody else has made it there first. If you do this, if you don't give them that reward, make sure there's something they get out of it. Maybe they find passageway leading somewhere else. Maybe they find clues to the person who found this treasure. Maybe they find clues to something in a nearby village where they can expose some plot there. But give them at least a plot point at the end there. If not, some type of treasure. In my opinion, a giant chest full of gold pieces is extremely boring. So dungeons in mine are usually built around information or some type of legendary magic item of some sort. So keep that in mind. That's the video for today. Ran a little longer than I wanted. Apologize for that. But again, that's the dungeon mindset. Stay away from the grids. Use your imagination. Walk through it in your head. And let's turn dungeons around and give them their proper respect. Thanks for watching.